Welcome to Novelist Spotlight, the podcast where published fiction writers are interviewed to gather their insights and writing lessons so we can use them to make ourselves better and more effective writers. There are just 3 things I ask of you, if appropriate to you and your experience. Please subscribe, please click on the like button, and please share this program link with any family members, friends, or colleagues who might be interested or benefit from the content. Now, on with our program.
This is Mike Consul, your host. Thank you for being here. Cormac McCarthy doesn't really do interviews. He's now 89 years old, the great Cormac McCarthy. And in his lifetime, there's been, I think, fewer than a dozen interviews, certainly fewer than 20 interviews. He doesn't like doing interviews, which is disappointing because we don't have the benefit then of his insights as a writer. Now, I think of a writer of his caliber as somebody who's got a lot of innate talent, and it's not simply a matter of telling us what he does and now we can write at his level. At the same time, though, we could benefit from the things that he has to say, learning more about what he does, how he approaches writing, what the man is all about. He keeps to himself. A couple of the few interviews he's done in his career was with the New York Times in 1992, and of course Oprah Winfrey in 2007. Oprah gets everybody. Now, I don't know if you saw this story in the New York Times about this very subject, but the New York Times wrote about how he often would answer questions by telling stories about other people. And the scholars of his work say that he has long been resistant to publicly analyzing his writing process. The interest in him, of course, has so much to do with the fact that, he won the Pulitzer Prize for his book, The Road. A lot of Cormac McCarthy fans consider Blood Meridian to be his best novel. That was his 5th novel back in 1985. And according to people who wrote about him on Wikipedia, it initially garnered only lukewarm, critical, and commercial success, but a lot of people consider that book to be his magnum opus today. Another one of his decorated books, though, is All the Pretty Horses, which he wrote in 1992. That got both the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. Remember No Country for Old Men? That was made into a movie, a harrowing movie at that. But what the New York Times wrote is that buried in the archives are largely forgotten interviews that were uncovered by a couple of academics, Diane Luce and Zachary Turpin. Since the New York Times wrote that article, they published their findings in the Cormac McCarthy Journal. So this is the kind of stuff I like to hear from writers is that looking back on those old interviews when he was young, before he was famous, before he really decided, I don't want to do interviews. And these were done with local newspapers. They dug them up out of the archives. And he said that writing was a compulsion. And interestingly, that it was not a conscious process. And when he was asked, give some practical advice to starting writers, he said, quote unquote, read. And oddly, he said that what he likes to do most is to stay in bed. They pulled this quote from one of his interviews. Some days I get my books and typewriter and just stay there, meaning in bed. Stay there all day or even a couple of days. So in 1973, he told Martha Bird of the Kingsport Times News he did not like to talk about his ideas or even write them down until he was sure what he wanted to do with them. Think about how many writers scramble and scribble down their ideas so they won't forget them. But what McCarthy told her is when you write something down, you pretty well kill it. Leave it loose and knocking around up there, and you never know, it might turn into something. Once he was ready to write, he said that the words flowed. My hands do the thinking, he said. It's not a conscious process. That's a gift. I mean, that's me talking. That's a gift. The ability to just let ideas gestate and suddenly take form, or not so suddenly take form, but understand that you've really got something now. And you sit down and those words just flow. I would say there's very, very few writers who can say that. I like this line he said, I can't explain how one creates a novel. It's like jazz. They create as they play, and maybe only those who can do it can understand it. So again, Cormac McCarthy said reading is a necessary part of writing. We all love to read if we like to write. The quotation that goes with that comment is practical advice, I believe, would be to read. He said that in 1969 about giving advice to aspiring writers. The quote goes on to say, you have to know what's been done, and you have to understand it. You know, Cormac McCarthy is what he's famous for, his short sentences, his writing. He's kind of a one-of-a-kind sort of guy. He writes a lot of short sentences. His writing is very spare. So who influenced him? He says it's gutsy writers. He calls them gutsy writers. People like Dostoevsky, Tolstoy, Faulkner, James Joyce, Herman Melville. Then this New York Times piece writes that in an article in 1971, which ran under the headline, Cormac McCarthy is one of the nation's most remarkable young authors. McCarthy said that he had more than 1,500 books in his collection, which range from contemporary novels to the collected works of Greek playwrights. So I don't know, how much did we learn from that? We all read. We largely have a compulsion to write. But the writing doesn't just flow for most of us. We can't just let an idea sit around in our head for weeks or months and suddenly realize we've got a full story, a novel-length story, and then sit down and the words flow. And writing for almost all of us, I would argue, is a conscious process. It's an unconscious process for him. His hands do the writing. It's as though he's channeling. That can be hard to relate to. And honestly, I'm not the biggest Cormac McCarthy fan. He's not a guy whose writing electrifies me, but I have, of course, tremendous respect for the guy. Look what he's accomplished. 12 novels, 2 plays, 5 screenplays, 2 short stories. His genres span Western and post-apocalyptic genres. And he is known in part for his graphic depictions of violence. And his writing style is his own. It's a fairly, well, I was always told not to use the word unique, but somewhat of a unique writing style and a according to the assessment in Wikipedia, recognizable by a spare use of punctuation and attribution. I got to know Cormac McCarthy when a friend was reading All the Pretty Horses. He was raving about that book. He wasn't the only one, because like I said, it won the National Book Award, the National Book Critics Circle Award. I tried to read The Road. I couldn't really finish it. It was a long, long walk. I was looking for something a little bit more dynamic. And you know, when they say that Cormac McCarthy uses punctuation sparingly, one of the ways he does that is that he replaces most commas with the word and. And the word and has been called the most important word in the McCarthy lexicon. He told Oprah Winfrey that he prefers simple declarative sentences. Well, who does that sound like? That sounds like Ernest Hemingway, although Hemingway was not just listed as one of his big influences. Maybe he doesn't want that close association, because it sounds, maybe his writing just sounds too much like Hemingway. He didn't want to sound like a guy overly influenced or imitative of Hemingway. So interestingly, 16 years after he published The Road, Cormac McCarthy is coming out with 2 new novels. One is called The Passenger, and the other is called Stella Maris. Stella Maris. And Alfred A. Knopf, which has been his longtime publisher, is going to release those books 1 month apart. These are supposed to be intertwined novels which represent a major stylistic and thematic departure for McCarthy. And they tell the doomed love story of a brother and sister, the siblings Bobby and Alicia Western. They're tormented by the legacy of their father, a physicist who helped develop the atom bomb, and by their love for an obsession with one another. It sounds interesting. And as they say, a departure from the stuff that he's done. A lot of Cormac McCarthy fans out there. After 16 years, I'm thinking these books are going to be issued with a lot of celebration. Is he going to sell millions of copies per usual? And the Cormac McCarthy legend will grow. Good for Cormac McCarthy. What a career. And what a mysterious man. For Novelist Spotlight, this is Mike Console.